Katie LaFalcia. Welcome to Irishgrannyhelen. It's time for our Saturday book, and we're on video number three of Sympathy Vote, a reinvestigation of the Valerie Percy murder by Glenn Wall. And I'm happy to say that I've heard from several people who've watched the first two videos who actually, if they weren't alive to remember it, they lived in the area, and it was quite a topic of conversation even when they were children. I mean, I was a child when this happened, but I remember it vividly, and I just wanted to share my very beautiful bookmarks, emery boards. Okay, let's get right down to it. If you haven't watched the first two videos, they're from last week. I should create a playlist and I'll try to remember. This is the story of the murder of Valerie Percy, one of the twin daughters of soon to become Senator Charles Percy of Illinois. Okay, we are on chapter 13, Many Leads, Little Progress, which really characterizes this completely. So the police scrutinized all the young male staffers in the campaign, even some that were even like half a foot taller than the suspect that had been seen by Lorraine, Valerie's mom, who walked in on this terrible crime. So, for example, Tully Friedman had been at the house to dinner that night, if you remember, and had left about 10:15 that night of the murder. And he's described as 33 to 40. No, Lorraine described the guy as 33 to 40, balding, kind of a slob. Then there was this guy that hung around the Percy house, but he didn't seem, he didn't fit the description. It didn't seem likely, but they had to look into him too because he had once asked Valerie out. Friedman claimed that he was in love with Valerie and she was in love with him, and that he had been a writer for Percy's 1964 campaign. There was another guy who had psychological problems who had stayed for a while in the guest house. So the campaign workers who were more likely, because they interacted with her more, they were hangers-on. The guy in the guest house, who was he? So Percy decided, if you remember, to stall his campaign after her murder for a little bit, and they decided to leave Illinois 3 days after the killing. They decided to leave for 2 weeks, and nobody really knew where they were going. It was a bit of a secret. His friend from Bell and Howell, Bill Roberts, the one who lived in Woodside, Northern California, he had them come and stay with him. If I remember correctly, that's the guy that took his son to the airport. Jay Rockefeller, who was Sharon, twin sister's boyfriend, he returned to his campaign. He was running for the West Virginia legislature. The brother-in-law, Lorraine's brother, his family, they all returned to New York City, and the house itself was roped off and guarded by police. So the family sneaked away. They went the same way they did before to make funeral arrangements. They went through the back to the neighbors and then out in their car from the neighbors. They boarded a private jet. Although a millionaire, Percy usually didn't fly private jets, but he got flown around usually by gentlemen farmers. These are wealthy landowners who supported him, who had big acreage, and they usually had little two-seater planes, and they were called like crop dusters, and he would hop from one gentleman's farm to another rather than be ostentatious and take private jet or fly commercial. His family was warned that you guys need to go to a secure location. Is there some kind of hit out on Charles in politics, so you never knew. And corporate. He didn't believe that, though. He thought that was pretty ridiculous. Roger, at Robert's house, said that they all stayed inside. Roger was the son. They all stayed inside because they were terrified. Percy spent the time working on his speech about restarting his campaign, and he was trying to overcome his hatred and self-pity and remorse. I have mentioned that I found his equanimity remarkable. I think his religion played a big part in his life, and it really provided him, and religion doesn't always do this, but it provided him with kind of a guideposts for how to handle this terrible tragedy. So the police researched their house. The Coast Guard was still in the lake searching around, and eventually they did find a bayonet. They found a 14.5-inch bayonet. It was World War II issue. I think this is something important we need to keep our eyes on. It had come from probably the Korean War or World War II. It was double-edged blade. It had a triangular pommel, and it could have left the marks that were left on Valerie. There had been 2 break-ins in the neighborhood right before Valerie's murder, the days before. The Piricellos, we talked about that, where somebody came upstairs and was poking around in his wife's dressing room. They came in through French doors and a balcony on the 2nd floor. They shimmied up a gutter. And then there was another one 7 miles southwest in Evanston that happened on June 30th. This was actually 10 weeks before Valerie's murder. It was a home invasion. Sharon Bubes, who was 19, was attacked while in bed asleep by a guy she thought was maybe between 15 and 18. Slim, medium build, maybe 5'10". He wore plastic glasses that were dark on the top, and then the bottom of the frame was clear. This was at 3 o'clock in the morning at her parents' home, where you have reasonable expectation being safe. She woke up and he was going through her underwear drawer. He struck her on the head with a ball-peen hammer, they think, but she ducked and mostly escaped getting hit. Her mother heard, very much like what happened to Valerie, and her mother went in and saw the attacker flee through a back window. 4 days after Valerie's murder, they had the Kenilworth police, several other community area police officers, the Cook County State Attorney's Office, the Chicago Police Crime Lab, all investigating this. Not, however, the Illinois State Police, but every single day the Illinois State Police Detective Bob Lamb warned his assistant that we're going to get called in. He said, I just feel like we're going to get called in. And his boss, named Richard Robb, always said, nah, they're not going to, they're handling it. They first heard of the case September 18th when they were working narcotics in Des Plaines, Chicago suburb. So they're, in the big city. And they were waiting for a shipment of narcotics that they expected about 8 o'clock in the morning. And the police got there about 7 o'clock in the morning, and they got a signal, too, that this stakeout was canceled because there'd been a murder. And they actually heard it on the regular radio. They weren't notified through the police channels. There was an AP report, shout out to Associated Press. There was an AP report where a blade had been found, and it wasn't rusted, and it could have been used in the crime. And when they heard that, they thought, okay. Meanwhile, 1,700 miles away in Tempe, Arizona, I think we all remember who lives there, 18-year-old David Mumbaugh ran into a police station and said he had just found a murder had happened. 20-year-old Laura Bernstein was the victim. She was an Arizona State University student who had transferred from Peoria, Illinois. And she had only been in Arizona for 10 days. She was stabbed 6 times while locking her bike at a friend's house. She wasn't robbed. She wasn't otherwise interfered with. I'm not usually so coy, but I've gotten in trouble this week. I'm on probation again with YT because of a comment. Well, it's a ridiculous situation. Ellie and I did a video, and we were describing, in order to criticize negatively, we were describing a belief of people, right-wing people, and it was regarded by the bots that they use as medical misinformation. You have to be so careful, and we tried very hard to be careful. We didn't realize that just describing something to prove it's wrong, to talk about how wrong it is, can't do that. And there are certain words you can't use. So anyway, they found a palm print and some fingerprints, and they sent those to Kenilworth. Mumbaugh was arrested and convicted of the whole crime, the guy that reported it, and it was considered motiveless. And I get the impression, well, we'll talk more about it. Now we're on chapter 14, which is called Joe D. Joe DeLeonardi, 34, Chicago police area homicide detective. He heard about the murder in the press. His department sent crime scene investigators to Kenilworth. He was a rising star in the Chicago Police Department, and eventually he became the acting superintendent of police. He didn't expect to get called into the case. He said they had no murder. They had no murder for 75 years, and I figured they'd call in somebody highly experienced for lots of expertise, but I never thought that I would be the one who would be called in. In the 70s, he became an influence in the development of the CBS show Kojak. And I never saw this, so I don't know. This might mean something to people who used to watch it because of his hat, and because he always smoked a cigar at work because it dealt with odors. And when he did the cigar, CBS got so many complaints about the smoking on the show, the TV show, that they replaced it with a lollipop. So decades later, the real Joe, the detective from whom the TV guy was copied, the real detective still wore the hat. In 79, he was demoted by Mayor Jane Byrne. He said it was because he had been too hard on the mob, that he hated the mafia. He was Italian-American in a very Irish police department, and he was offended personally by the Italian mob. He said Byrne got complaints from the First Ward Alderman, John Darko, and the Ward Committeeman, Pat Marcy, and both had alleged mafia ties. Mafia ties. John Darko was the official liaison to the mob. I guess there was such a thing. It's a city hall, between the mob and city hall, and the other city offices. This offended Joe D. At the time of the murder, he was really picked because he was the best homicide cop, and he worked the case until his wedding in November 19th, 1966. And he wasn't very happy with the way that the family had just taken off and been allowed to go. He felt like, we're in the middle of we're at the beginning of a murder investigation. This is not a good idea. They weren't available for questions, and he had important questions. The question we need to ask, which begs to be asked, is, were they intentionally dodging something? The police were really dissatisfied. 12 days after the murder, the Percys were still on the West Coast. A police official is quoted in the Sun-Times in a statement that nearly seems to contradict itself. Quote, "The Percys have cooperated fully with us, but we want every bit of information they have about what happened in their home on the morning of the murder. It's difficult to explore their recollections completely by questioning them through liaison men." In other words, they were not speaking directly to the police. That's not cooperation. Percy's staff members actually inserted themselves between the family and the police. The chief in Kenilworth tolerated it, you know, small town, right? But this made De Leonardi frustrated. Would this have been tolerated if it weren't Percy, who was a millionaire and a candidate? The daughter of John Kosaric said that her dad was pals of a sort, and she remembers going to the Percys, or, you know, because her father was friends with the Percys, going to the Percys' house and swimming in the mansion's pool. And at that time, she said her father had a side hustle, business. He hired off-duty police to patrol wealthy houses on the North Shore for money. It was called the North Suburban Patrol, so he was sort of moonlighting, I guess you'd call it. Percy had hired them, and at least one Kenilworth cop on the homicide investigation worked indirectly like that for Percy. So there was a conflict of interest, I guess. McDonough remembers Kosaric as a guy hanging on to get a pension. That, you know, he was doing this side hustle because really he was getting ready to retire. He made more from this North Shore, what was it called, North Suburban Patrol, than he did from being on the police department. He didn't, McDonough, this young guy, you know, that was hired temporarily for the summer, and he said this guy was just counting the days till his pension, and really his heart wasn't in his police department job at all. And when the guy wrote the book, Glenn Wall wrote this book in, let me get the date exactly right, 2013, most of the police that were involved had already died. In 2011, the modern Kenilworth Police Department, Lieutenant David Miller, he denied proof. He denied that there was any kind of proof that the staff acted as a buffer. But Chief Daly said differently. So, you know, some of the people on the police department were willing to face it and others weren't. So Chief Daly revealed that a Percy friend had indeed been placed between the Percy family and the police. The same day the Sun-Times mentioned the liaison, the Independent newspaper paraphrased Kenilworth's police chief. Police Chief Robert M. Daly said Charles Percy, Republican nominee for senator and father of the 21-year-old victim, and other members of his family will be asked additional questions about the case when they return to Kenilworth, probably in a few days. It's kind of bright. I've got a big window here. The story goes on to say, Daly said a friend of the Percy family has been acting as a liaison contact in their absence, keeping them informed on the progress of the investigation. So this is a quote from the chief of police in the newspaper. So Joe De Leonardo felt like a guest while he was working with the Kenilworth police. He felt like he was, you know, tolerated. He wanted to get along with them, and there's no real documentation about friction or displeasure with how the case had been looked at, but he did say to others that Percy's leaving and not answering questions was a problem. It hindered the investigation in the early days, and that seems like, how could you argue? Of course it did. In 2011, this is still confirmed by the 87-year-old Scott Cohen, Percy's press secretary. So there's validation there. There were not many calls from the police to their office, to the campaign office. So there's no way to know now why were there so few who discouraged the trading back and forth of information. Why were they slow to return police calls or ignore them? Definitely get the sense there was some obstruction of communication going on. There was dissatisfaction in the Illinois State Police with Percy's cooperation, and I suppose even though if he's influential in Illinois politics, state politics, the state police would still feel that added pressure, perhaps less than the small town people who would really be impressed by his importance. But the state police admitted that while Percy's was gone, he was preoccupied with the logistics of organizing his office. The state police guy that they talked to, he was so busy trying to get the investigative office organized in Kenilworth that lack of information from Percy was not foremost in his mind. But boy, you need to strike, 48 hours, right? You need to strike early. He was getting leads, forming teams, creating a filing system. He said, their trip didn't bother me because it was not we were not set up. We had to set up a whole management office. The FBI ran down leads out of state and internationally. So now we're on chapter 15. We're going to get pulled into this. This is the title of the chapter. 1 week after the murders, they began doing They began to do lie detector tests to coworkers and friends. The discovery of the bayonet in the lake was revealed. Then the state police, Lamb and Robb, were called in to organize the investigation. Chief Daly told reporters that they were investigating report from or by a Northwest University student that he had seen a man in front of the Percy home not too many hours before the murder. I didn't write it. I think it says 4. I can't read my writing. But like within a few hours of the murder, there was a guy lurking around the house. Daly was pretty successful in keeping leaks. There were no leaks. They were very careful about that. He told the Alton Evening Telegraph, this is a paper, that he had 400 leads. The number 1 lead was a red sports car thought to be burglars in front of the Jim Smith house of Winnetka in 1965. They were stopped by the North Suburban Patrol, and this guy lived right next door to Piricello. So they're following up this red car that had been involved in something in the neighborhood. Piricello prevented the robbery at his house one day before Valerie was killed. I mean, it's a break-in, but nothing was taken. The burglar at the Smiths dropped a shotgun that he was stealing and sped away in a red car. So that was an important lead. The second important lead was a motorcyclist that Roddy had stopped. If you remember, was it Vernon Roddy, I think his name was. He had stopped minutes after the murder. He saw the guy he's a rough character, on the motorcycle, and he went after him. The man couldn't tell him where he'd been at the time of the murder. And so this was still under investigation. They were trying to get more details. They were looking at the fibers in the cut screen and in Valerie's room, fibers from the glove found in the yard. The glove did have blood on it, so they were looking at all of this. And this information was very carefully shared by the chief of police, and he was very good at not letting all these other 400 leads. Never heard them. Chapter 16, the Illinois State Police. So 8 days after the murder, the state police created a chain of command. They came in and whipped everybody into shape. Daly became the primary press contact, this Chief Daly. The state police realized that too many local police departments were involved in this, and there was no control over what was going on. So they asked for Chicago homicide and for burglary cops. They wanted to get experts in the two things that they thought may have been involved in this. Lamb took a week to get things organized, and this is the time he was referring to. Wasn't so concerned about not having communication with the Percys being gone, because we were trying to create some order out of chaos. They moved their headquarters out of the local police station, which was tiny, to a bigger space 2 miles north to the Winnetka police station where they could spread out. They had lots of leads and they needed more room and they needed more manpower to follow up on all the leads. The advantage was saying this is the Percy case, it got a lot of doors open and they got instant help. The downside was they got a lot of false leads from all over the country because every crackpot in the country wanted to be involved. They had 11 teams of 2 investigators each to track new leads. 5 of the teams were state police from all over Illinois that were moved in. Then they had 2 from Kenilworth, including Bill Sumner. So now we're up to team number 8, a former Chicago lieutenant, now a Cook County State's Attorney's Office investigator. And then they had a group from Evanston, and they had a couple made from nearby police. So they tried to get a variety of fresh eyes, people with a broader expertise, and perhaps fewer loyalties to the Percy family and more loyalty just to solving the crime. Lamb requested to Leonardi and his partner, John Samuel from Chicago. Each team was sent on a different path. Winnetka police officers from the night shift, they sneaked into the case files after hours and found out about the Thorensons, but not about the stolen war mementos. So they were looking at the Thorensons a little bit, but they didn't realize that these 2 very troubled young men, some of the things they'd stolen were war mementos. That sounds like it could be a World War II bayonet. They even, in the investigators of this case, even, so shocking, I'm sure you'll all think so, consulted psychics. September 27th, Lamb was organizing the teams, and this was DeLeonardo and Semel's first day. DeLeonardo began writing down details, and he made a list of phone numbers and then a separate list of evidence and a list of suspects, including suspects from Chicago and Virginia. William Thoresen was not on the list. He had 7 pages of notes and no arrests, but lots of rumors. There was a big secret that they were keeping out of the public eye. Lorraine had a history of mental problems, and they really investigated, was this a case of domestic violence? Was her whole story a lie to protect herself? And there were rumors flying that because of Percy's power and money, that a situation like that would be hidden and there would never be an arrest. But the Chicago police, they knew that Lorraine's story was true. It would have been impossible to stage all the defensive wounds, because what would have happened was, obviously there was a struggle, and inevitably the intruder would have been injured. And they knew that he had been punched. I don't know how they knew that. Oh, I guess he punched Valerie. I mean, he had beaten her up pretty badly. I guess they're talking about her blood on him. I guess the point they're making is Lorraine wouldn't have time to clean up. I mean, just basically, she could not have staged that scene, considering what was done. Nobody at Percy's house was injured. The break-in at Piricello's was disconnected. It seemed like the same tool had been used to cut the screen at both houses, and the Chicago cops had dealt with fake home invasions before, and they could not be fooled. I mean, when they knew a real one when they saw one. Couldn't pull the wool over those guys' eyes. They came from the big city, and if you're not a hardened career criminal and there's some terrible event and you try to pass it off as a stranger, an intruder, Never goes well. Said Lorraine could not have done it. Valerie had been struck over a dozen times with a military weapon that was operated by a killer with extreme malice. It was DeLeonardi said this crime had angry male written all over it. McDonough saw that since the police from the state had taken over and moved headquarters to Winnetka, there was far less media activity in the Kenilworth station. The state police had first priority. They got all the attention now. It's kind of a bummer for the small town police. The state police were all about the administrative part to bring order to what was a massive, chaotic investigation. They brought an office assistant with them who maintained the case progress report and log in a book, which was great because there is a good record, a written record of what was done. Joe DeLeonardi stated started doing street detecting right away, door to door. He did door knocking for blocks around the Percy's house. He said he could see the wealth in the neighborhood. This is a quote. He says, "You speak to a butler or a caretaker first." He spoke with Percy's butler, Whitting. He said he was cooperative and candid and told DeLeonardi that Valerie had many young campaign workers to pool parties, that it was very easy to pinpoint her room. This guy was relatively new to the job. I believe he'd been there for 10 days. Interesting to get that perspective. DeLeonardi told Daly, the chief, to give all the campaign workers polygraphs. Almost let God sort them out. Give them all polygraphs. And Daly did not agree. He said, and this is a quote, I can't believe this. Oh my God. The chief says, and I'm not going to give them all polygraphs because, quote, this is a pristine town. Joe said that I was aggressive to a point. I was a guest, and he had to tread carefully. Apparently, the writer says that Daly forgot that the Thorisons lived in his pristine town. Joe asked to see Valerie's purse, and he got it. He said it had been sanitized. There was nothing significant in it to investigate. And he asked, where are the personal items? And he got no response. And he said, you could tell when a purse has been cleaned out. There were no receipts, no notes, no business cards, no addresses, no random flotsam and jetsam that you'd see in somebody's purse taken at the spur of the moment. Someone had gone through and sanitized it. But he wasn't even on the case for 8 days. The contents of the purse were never revealed. The purse was not in the inventory of evidence at the final end of the case. There is no evidence that she had a purse. But there was, because he went through it. He says the Percy case is the only one that he's ever been in where civilians supposedly killed somebody with a bayonet. And they're pretty sure, given the nature of her wounds and the marks on her body from the hilt, they're pretty sure that's what it was. It was really odd. And the similarities with the Piricillo break-in, with the screens cut for entry and the glass cut, similar fashion, both had blue smudges used by the same tool to get in. Whatever that tool was, it left blue smudges. Now we have chapter 17, the inquest. There was a horde of reporters, and it eventually ebbed by the end of week 1. And McDonough said that. They kind of just filtered on out. Some still came by Kenilworth Station or called. They had staked out the station for 2 or 3 weeks, and they got a dozen calls a day from other police stations that they had people in the other police station confessing to her murder. McDonough learned how to say a lot to the press while revealing nothing. On October 4th, the Percys returned, and Roger went back to the university in Menlo Park. That night, Percy met with his staff to finish his speech. And he said that he was sensitive to looking like, he didn't want to look like he was trying for a sympathy vote, hence the title of the book. So he decided not to mention the murder at all. McDonough had tried to get an interview with NBC before the murder. Oh, okay. I was like, why are they interviewing him before the murder? He tried to get a job interview. It's been a while since I read this. He tried to get a job interview with NBC before the murder, 2 days after the murder, because they turned him down. And 2 days after the murder, lo and behold, they sent him a letter to come in and have a job interview. Afterwards, Chief Daley was now the most sought after by the media. And after Chief Daley, McDonough became sort of the de facto press secretary. So Daley and McDonough both were still being sought out to a certain extent by the media, but the horde had left. He wrote to a friend about the conflict of wanting to be one of them, wanting to be a reporter, while having a job that made him withhold information to the press. He was in this odd situation. He says, I don't think that this will be saved. Usually a murder is solved in the first 72 hours, or not at all, and I don't think this will happen. October 5th, Percy had his first press conference in 18 days since the murder. He announced his return to the campaign. He said, it's what my family wants me to do, and he made absolutely no mention of the murder. He took no questions from the press. His opponent, Paul Douglas, was a gentleman who had suspended his campaign until Percy resumed. I'll refrain from saying what I think about that possibility of happening today. On October 15th, the state police noted in a report that they were advised by Kenilworth investigators that William Thornton, known to Kenilworth officers as a nut, that they made this report about the nut. Kenilworth is too dead, and Thornton would like to do something to liven it up. It's not clear when Thornton had said this and what specifically he may have meant by the remark. At this time, and perhaps most importantly, state authorities were also informed that Thornton's former probation officer had already contacted the FBI in Los Angeles. The officer told at least one federal agent that, in his opinion, William Thornton, quote, should be considered a suspect in this Percy murder case. The notification was enough to kick out, in Robert Lamb's words, a new lead. Thornton was now a suspect, albeit one of many, in the Percy slaying. It seems like he might go to the top of the list. But back at Percy headquarters, the campaign headquarters, things had, on the surface, returned to normal. There was an unidentified fingerprint on the cut door glass at the Percys. Unidentified. Fall was approaching. Lamb and Robb from Chicago had established an organization with their teams, but the trail had gone cold. The Percy house updated their security with a very serious security system. New locks, frequent police patrols. Dr. Hoff, the doctor next door who came the night of the murder, was going with his son to look at colleges, and therefore he first installed bars and new locks on his house before leaving his wife and other child home alone. Up the road, millionaire William Clement Stone put bulletproof glass in his mansion. This kept the fire department from breaking windows later when a fire broke out. They couldn't get into the house to stop the fire, but there were no injuries. The Percy family was struggling. Nobody felt safe. Lorraine kept the floodlights all night long, all the TVs and the radios going. Nighttime was very difficult. Can you imagine the trauma? I mean, I hope this poor woman got help. Still, gawkers drove by every day. The Cook County Morgue, October 13th, had the coroner's inquest. Many media people were there, over 60 TV, radio, news. There are pictures of it. It just looks sad. The Percys just look tired and sad. There are pictures in the book. All three testified, the mother, the father, Sharon. Charles said that the French doors were heavy and hard to open, and they were never used. The piano was up there. It was an awkward spot. Sharon testified that Valerie had not been threatened by anybody. Winning, the butler, testified. He had arrived in September from England. Questions were asked about 20-year-old Fred Dawson, who lived 4.5 miles away. After Valerie's murder, he tried to do himself permanent harm. He told the police, "They're after me." He owned a glass cutter, and he actually was successful in that attempt to himself in October 5th. Daly said that Dawson was no better suspect than anybody else. The conclusion was the murderer was unknown and the investigation would continue. October 17th, 1 month after the crime, the family and their very closest friends were cleared. The police were still looking at campaign workers, school associates, and anyone else that might be peripherally involved with the family. More than 700 people were interviewed in 4 weeks. I can't imagine finding 700 people that anyone would interview if I were in this situation. So the evidence they did have was the bayonet, the bloody glove, the cut broken glass, the cut screen and its fibers, the blood on the banister, and the palm and fingerprints that were not identified. Chapter 18, the election. The inquest brought more attention to the Percys than the campaign did, meaning that people who may not have paid attention to him on the campaign trail now were giving it a lot of attention. Before the murder, Douglas had been in the lead, but now Nixon predicted that Percy would win. Daly announced that he bought a house in Wisconsin, but would stay on the job as long as the board wanted. This is the police chief. He had submitted a request to retire August of '66, a month before the murder, and he had said it would be effective Halloween, and he stayed on to help them. The Percy campaigned till the last minute and traded, as they say, traded shots with Chicago Mayor Daley, traded insults with Chicago Mayor Daley. Burgard noticed that Percy now always seemed to have a state trooper with him everywhere he went, and this was not at Percy's request. He also mentioned that Percy seemed like a real person, like an ordinary person, in relationship to his pain around the murder. He didn't strike him as phony emotion, and he seemed genuinely really traumatized by the whole thing. And there was just so much press coverage of Percy around the election because of his daughter's murder. There, coverage of him putting his own vote in the box on the TV. He then went on to several precincts, part of Operation Eagle Eye, and I forget reading about this. I wonder what this is about. Oh, okay. It was this campaign, Operation Eagle Eye, meant to assure no voter fraud by providing Chicago precincts with what's called election judges. The media speculated about sympathy votes. Election night, headquarters were in Chicago's Sheraton Hotel for Percy. Well, spoiler alert, Percy won. The issues of the campaign were Vietnam, race, and inflation. So now he's a senator, and they had to go to Washington, D.C. They bought a house in D.C., and they moved into that house with their two youngest children. They kept a full staff at the house at Kenilworth, but they were seldom there. Sharon and Roger were both away at school. If Valerie was the target, the killer took the risk of alarms and others being at home, because it would have been very hard to find Valerie alone. She was never alone. She was almost always with somebody. Perhaps she knew her killer because the killer seemed to know the layout of the house. He escaped in a rush through a big house and no hesitation, no knocking anything over. Dee Leonardi said, I was there at least 20 times and I couldn't find my way around. He believes that this was motivated in part by burglary. I would like to debate the psychology of this with him. There was a spate of burglarized home invasions all along the lake in a number of villages. For example, Lake Bluff, 16 miles north of Kenilworth. In January 13th of 1965, Fred Wacker Jr., a businessman, a race car driver, and he was in two different musical groups. He lived with his wife and children in a sprawling estate. 20 months before the Percy murder, two men broke into the house. Wacker was away on business. They wore ski masks. His wife woke to the sound of breaking glass in a French door. That ought to ring a bell. One shone flashlights in her face. That should sound familiar. And said, just be quiet, nothing will happen to you or your family. They fled with $20,000 in furs, jewelry, and a gun. She called the police. The photo of the French door was sent to Lamb, and the glass was cut exactly as Percy's French door glass had been cut on the night of Valerie's murder. A small circular glass shape had been scored on the glass on Wacker's door and knocked out. As at the Percys, an X was scored over the hole and more of the pane was smashed. Lamb had never seen such a technique used except in these two instances. Two other facts were not lost on the state police. Not unlike Valerie Percy's killer, one of the home invaders shone a flashlight in the eyes of Mrs. Wacker, who was the only one of several people on the premises to be awoken. The summer of '66, Roger, the son, was mugged 3 times going to his car in the evenings. I had forgotten about this. I think this is significant too. He remembers his early 1960s Porsche being more like a glorified Volkswagen than a coveted sports car. But it was a magnet for muggers, and he said the muggings were always when I was about to get into the car. The third time the mugger appeared, showed his knife, and I just said no. I was mad. I was fed up having to ask the state of Illinois for another driver's license. So the mugger turned on his heels and left. When he picked up his sister Valerie a few minutes later, he told her what had happened again and said, "Don't tell Daddy." Percy gave signed copies of Steinbeck's American and Americans for Christmas to all the police, including who were on the investigation, including McDonough. McDonough told a friend that 12 people in the area have confessed to murder. And he got a job on the Chicago Tribune. December 20th, Louise Thorson was arrested at Kennedy Airport trying to ship 20 crates of military weapons and ammunition to Chicago. These included flamethrowers, a bazooka, and many small arms. They were inspected after a handgun fell out of a box that she placed on the airport counter. She posted $12,500 bail. After she was released, William, in a rage, tried to throw her out the 20th floor of the New York Hilton, and a mutual acquaintance who was there intervened. This added to his police record, which after 15 years was now 4 pages long. Okay, I'm going to stop here. This is a perfect place to stop. So this is the end of video number 3. And we'll be back with another video. Things always pick up and get interesting when William Thornton shows back up. I can hardly wait to look at this with Deborah Lupien. Okay, thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I hope you're enjoying it. And I'll be back with video 4, Slung Foil.